Cloud Talk Radio. This is a McCullough Report. And I'm Dr. Peter McCullough. And this is also Courageous Discourse Substack. I have to tell you that we do both the audio and the video components of this broadcasted. And it's a great pleasure to welcome to the show Mr. Jim Haslam. Jim has a lot to tell us. But first, let's learn about him. Jim, tell us a little bit about, about your background and how you came to come on the show.
So thanks for having me, Peter. What I am is a mechanical engineer who's been working on commercial international projects for most of my career. So a lot of that came to a halt during COVID. And I think a lot of us basically had time to reflect on what this thing is and where it came from. So that was about 5 years ago now, as we're at the end of 2024. And my interest slowly increased over time during the outbreak. And it was more interested on what leaked out of that lab in Wuhan instead of the actual lab leak itself. So for the past, 4+ years, I've looked at it off and on over time. And, contrary to popular belief, what it is, is there's a lot of evidence for what it is. A lot of people have this idea in their mind that, like I did early in the outbreak, it's Wuhan, it's China, it's communist country. We'll never know much. Most of the evidence will be buried. And it turns out that there was a ton of evidence, but it was buried in our own backyard. So for the past, year or so, what I've been looking at, is that evidence. And I've assembled it, in what I think is a pretty, easy to tell story, which is what most people need to understand. This thing was an accident in my mind. It wasn't anything intentional. This thing involved, what will be called, I guess, good intentions, bad outcome would be the best way to put it.
Well, before we kind of fully develop this, tell us a little bit about where'd you go to college and where do you live now?
So I went to school at University of Louisiana Lafayette, mechanical engineer. So I've always had a career up and down the Gulf Coast working in the oil and gas industry.
Okay.
That allows me to have an international, scope. So a lot of people ask me, what are your credentials in this debate you're wading into? And I think my credentials are a lack of credential. I've come to realize over time that there's a conflict of interest on both sides of this debate. So this involves a little more U.S. academic, Western academic research than I think any of us are comfortable even discussing. So that's essentially the background behind, me. And I started a blog on Substack called Reverse Engineering: The Origins of SARS-CoV-2. And some of your own readers, I think, have come across it over my 2 years of writing it.
But tell me, why do you think you, among kind of all the engineers that you pal around with, why you? Why did you start this inquiry?
So it's a good question. I think I understand evolution better than most engineers. I understand it better than most biologists. I think I understand it better than most PhDs. I think I understand it then, almost as good, if not better than most virologists. So it's a bit of a freak of nature that I can see, things as they evolve, over time. And there was quite a few wrinkles in, I guess, this story as the virus spread over time. So I guess I could just dive into one of them and essentially,
Well, let me just ask you before you do, why do you think, compared to you, why do you think there is such a lack of curiosity in the world? I mean, we've got 7 billion people. Almost everybody got sick with this thing. The average person I know, or the average person in my family, has zero curiosity about this.
It's an icky subject. It's an uncomfortable subject. If it's an engineered, genome, that is not comfortable to discuss at the dinner table. Anything that comes out of a biolab, is by itself an icky subject.
Do you think people just want to forget about it?
I do. But I also think people want closure. That's what I think we all seek, is closure on it. Because
well, listen,
that's my reason behind doing this.
Right. So maybe the way to do this, Jim, is to do it in a timeline. So tell us about you dove into this and you've assembled what's happened, I think, in a very compelling way. So just take it away.
So I start the book, chapter 1, in October of 2019 in Wuhan. The name of the first chapter is called Identifying Patient Zero. I name her in the book. I don't know if I want to name her, online because she's just the first victim of many.
Now,
So,
before you get going, tell us the title of the book and where people can find it.
so the title of the book is COVID-19 Mystery Solved. This probably shows it backwards. It doesn't really matter. It leaked from a Wuhan lab, but it's not Chinese junk. And essentially, what I've done is shown you the genome sequence here. And if you flip it over to the back, you can see the genome sequence here. And there's a piece missing right in the middle. And right there is essentially, the start of the story. This is
Okay.
kind of as close, I think, if not what most people can see and need to see as far as the SARS-CoV-2 genome being engineered. There was a gap right in the middle of it, and so that's where I
Okay.
start the story.
Okay.
It's chapter 1 in Wuhan, and
Hmm.
it's in the BSL-4 lab.
Hmm.
So I think a lot of us kind of got sidetracked with that BSL-2, BSL-3 debate. The narrative, if you're into lab leak, is that Tony Fauci took some of your hard-earned tax dollars and tossed it over the Pacific Ocean, and some Chinaman messed up. I don't start anyway that way. I start in the high level BSL-4. It's why any of us that were interested in the Wuhan lab leak, were there because of that BSL-4. That was the first thing I think most of us learned, was that this thing had a bioweapon BSL-4 with the PLA or the CCP in there, and they were doing dirty things, and all of a sudden they blew up the world. And they tried to cover it up by, making people go quiet and all that.
Hmm.
So it turns out that there was a Western woman inside that BSL-4, and it turns out that Western woman was Tony Fauci's personal contractor. She was essentially working on one of his projects. She was
What?
working on one of his $82 million projects. So she is one of the what I call a Wuhan a soldier, basically, in this is a spacesuit, and she's experimenting on one of these projects that has been shipped to her. It's called the cold chain. So I'm going to make this very clear up front. A lot of people think when you get into the U.S. side and the Western side of involvement, they think a virus that leaked from a Wuhan lab was engineered in Wuhan. And I'm basically dive right in and tell you, if a virus is engineered, wherever it spilled over into the human population does not tell us where it was engineered. So a genome could be created, in the US or in Western Europe or in Timbuktu, China, and it could be shipped somewhere else where it escapes from the lab. It's called the cold chain. And these international virologists is one of the most international industries I've ever come across. It is one of the most incredible industries. I mean, these people don't, live at home. They live in planes. They live behind laptops. They are on their feet out in the bush. And
Hmm.
it is one of the most incredible industries in that regard. They don't care about your passport. They only care about what your access is. And one of these Western women, from Australia, had access to that Wuhan BSL-4. And I dive into her story about how she got there and what she's doing. And she's running an experiment. She's received a package from a U.S. lab, and she has basically been given instructions to, inject, a serum into one lab animal. And then she's supposed to monitor the spread of the serum, what you would call a virus, I now call a vaccine. And she's basically just has to do one purpose, and that's just test it inside this lab on her lab animals. And it gets out, obviously. And it spreads around the globe. And as we trace that spread around the globe in the book, and it goes all the way on to its home base, which is where the story gets, I think, really interesting.
Wow. Now, the Australian woman, is she identified?
Yeah, I name her. She's, a very important part of the story, but I don't want to, make her a big deal or anything.
But how are you certain it was a Western woman? Are there documents that you uncovered from the lab, or?
Yes, her story didn't add up. So that's essentially what it was. She lied about what she was doing in there. She claimed to be working on Ebola, and she mysteriously left in November 2019. And we all took it, myself included, that story to be true. Then in September of 2021, a document leak called DARPA Diffuse. I think we've all probably
Hmm.
heard of that now. If not, if just Google it and you'll read up on it. And essentially, the New York Times will admit, wow, this was a cookbook for creating SARS-CoV-2. But DARPA, the small agency within the DoD, the Pentagon, with only $3 billion a year, did not fund it. It was too expensive, and they went on to fund a few other teams. But she was on the losing team. But her name showed up in the document that was leaked by a U.S. Marine named Joseph Murphy. And the first name I saw in the document was Ralph Barrick. I think we know who he is. He is this
Hmm.
coronavirus expert in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, who's come under a lot of grief of late. Even Robert Redfield has been online basically calling him the mastermind behind this whole thing.
Hmm.
It was always a dark cloud over him. But when this document leaked in September 2021, he basically, Ralph Barrick, said, I would insert furin cleavage sites into live coronaviruses and test them on live bats in Wuhan. So obviously, Ralph Barrick is in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, which is 12,000 kilometers away from Wuhan. So it never made sense how something he created wound up in Wuhan. But when her name, this woman's name, appeared in this document right next to his, and there she was without a story anymore. She said she was working on Ebola, but according to her resume, she was working on coronavirus replication. She said she didn't have live bats in the lab. It later came out she did have live bats in the lab. She never explained why she left in November of 2019, which is an interesting timeline because most people believe the outbreak was starting around November 2019. I even identify her cell phone. I hate to do this, but it was public record. So I have her cell phone pinging the cell phone tower inside that Wuhan BSL-4 from June of 2019 until October of 2019. The whole BSL-4, this is a remote, giant, maximum containment, biolab that you have to wear a spacesuit to go into. It is what I call some of the most exclusive territory on planet Earth. You have to have credentials, background checks, health checks to go into them. It is, the best of the best. And she's, she is the best of the best. She's what's called a bat immunologist. And she makes a good living doing this. She spent time at Harvard. She spent time in Canada. She's been all over the world. Kenya, you could see her cell phone travel the world. And she went from Beijing to Wuhan in June 2019. And then she goes into the Wuhan lab until she comes out in October of 2019. The whole lab goes quiet. There's no cell phone within sight of the lab from the month of October 2019. And then she reappears, after about a month of gone missing. She reappears with her boss. I will name her boss. Her boss is Linfa Wang. He is the Duke Emerging Infectious Disease Director in Singapore. This is Duke University. This is where I get into my point. The lack of credentials is actually a bit of an upside because this thing is getting really quick to evolve a Western cover up. So this Duke University professor flies into Wuhan in November, meets up with Danielle. They go in, I just said her name, they go into the Wuhan BSL-4. They now have cleaned up the mess that they've created. They know it has escaped, they assume it has. And they have now vacated the premise, essentially, and moved on, and hopefully, nothing to see here. So from November of 2019 until January 10th of 2020, rumors are building in Wuhan of essentially something circulating in Wuhan. And on January 10th of 2020 is a really big date in COVID history. It's the born-on date, not like your beer. It's the born-on date for the SARS-CoV-2 genome. So on January 10th of 2020, when most of us didn't even know of a town named Wuhan, a genome sequence was published for every virologist on the planet to see it. And they look at that 30,000 nucleotides. And essentially on that date, her boss, Linfa Wang, resigned as the director of the Emerging Infectious Disease Division for Duke. So he stepped down, essentially. He recognized the genome. He recognized the sequence. He recognized, the fact that his own a subordinate was inside the Wuhan BSL-4 when it got out. So from there, I traced the cover up all the way to what's January 31st now of 2020. So I think we know what January 31st of 2020 is if you're into Lab Leak. That is the date Christian Andersen sent Tony Fauci an email that said, we, four world-class evolutionary virologists, find the genome inconsistent with expectations from evolutionary theory. And the only reason they know that on January 31st of 2020 is because some China woman named the Bat Lady has published a genome sequence that has exposed Ralph Barrick's fear and cleavage site. So I don't want to get into the details of it because that's the alignment I just showed you at the beginning of the book. So essentially what we thought the Bat Lady was like this villain has essentially become part of our whistleblowers. So I've identified two whistleblowers already. One was Major Murphy within the U.S. Marines who leaked the DARPA Diffuse document. The second one is the Bat Lady, who we all thought, yourself included, myself included, did this thing. We thought she was the one that created this thing because she wasn't acting in an upfront manner. But essentially, she published a piece of evidence that made SARS-CoV-2 look engineered. And someone like Christian Andersen sitting in his office in San Diego, California at the Scripps Institute, behind a screen, just like you and me, pops up that genome sequence and does what he calls the alignment. And he's staring at what is essentially Ralph Barrick's fear and cleavage site right in the middle of it. It's staring right at him. And the guy I've gone back and I've traced his movements online. These are public figures. We've already got Linfa Wang and Danielle Anderson's cell phone number. Now we got Christian Andersen posting online a week before the genome sequence is published on January 31st. He thinks the genome's natural because he has nothing to compare it to. Now all of a sudden he wants to call the FBI. He called up Tony Fauci on January 31st, 2020 and said, I'm going to call the FBI. This thing's engineered. And if you're into Lab Leak, Fauci was up until 3 a.m. on that Friday night, covering his butt, sending out CYA emails. And so none of us really knew what he was doing. Anyone that's read those emails at 3 a.m., you're like, this is not the normal behavior of an 80-year-old man on a Friday night. I mean, he is like the house is on fire. I mean, this is incredible. Up until then, most of us still thought someone in Wuhan had messed up. But he's trying to cover his own butt because he's funded the DARPA Diffuse project, and he knows this. So he tells Christian Andersen, look, I'll call the FBI, but he picks up the phone and he calls Ralph Barrick. He called Ralph Barrick. He called Ralph Barrick on January 31st. And so they had that teleconference, that infamous teleconference now the next day on Saturday, February 1st of 2020. And they all get together because Christian Anderson, who we also thought was a bit of a villain, is now went to call the FBI and they're like, well, hold on here, Christian. Let's all talk about this genome that you're looking at, this engineered evidence you're talking about. And so they all got together on this February 1st 2020 teleconference, and they all is world-class virologists: Christian Anderson, Bob Gary, Eddie Holmes, Tony Fauci, Francis Collins, head of the NIH. You got Christian Drosten in Germany. You got Ron Fouchier in the Netherlands. You got Marion Koopmans in the Netherlands. And there's half a dozen others. Jeremy Farrar. So Jeremy Farrar was the main guy at Wellcome Trust, who's kind of like the Tony Fauci of the UK. I think most of us know he is. And he was one that organized this teleconference because he's hearing rumors from Christian Anderson in the US that this thing's engineered and he wants to get everyone together. And so with the teleconference going on February 1st, 2020, Ralph Barrick's quietly listening. And this was not public record until it came out this year in interviews by the COVID committee. So with Ralph Barrick quietly listening, he has listened to Christian Anderson's evidence for engineering. Then Ralph Barrick goes quiet, does not announce his presence on this teleconference. It basically is not a video conference, it's a teleconference, so they can't see each other's faces. Tony Fauci has invited Ralph Barrick secretly onto this teleconference to listen to Christian Anderson's evidence for engineering.
Oh.
Ralph Barrick waits 2 days. On February 3rd, there's a meeting when everyone else is around. It's like another high-level meeting. This was more U.S., focused virologists. Ralph Barrick ambushes, attacks is the word that Christian Anderson uses, attacks him for suggesting the genome is engineered. So it never really made sense why, this guy, Christian Anderson, a world-class evolutionary virologist, went from Friday night, January 31st, it's engineered, I'm going to call the FBI, to becoming part of the cover-up. It's just peer pressure, it's nothing villainous. It's nothing, evil but inside of anyone. But when you have someone attacking you, a coronavirus specialist like Ralph Barrick, out of the blue, you basically are going to recoil. And he recorded this down and it was documented. And the only reason it came to light was during interviews, which is incredible in itself. So this is essentially the beginning of the end, of the story, I think, that we can all run from. To make it a long story short, the Reader's Digest, it's that Tony Fauci funded the DARPA Diffuse project of Peter Daszak at EcoHealth. And that's essentially, the way this thing started. And what we thought was a Chinaman messing up in Wuhan was a bunch of Western academics messing up in the US, shipping their samples off to Wuhan for testing, where it leaked accidentally. But the creation and cover up of COVID, I do not call an accident. That was intentional.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was certainly very intentional. So let me ask you a few questions now, because everyone has kind of their understanding of it. This biosecurity level 4 lab, the annex that was built, did your research indicate that Jacques Chirac and a company, bioMérieux, built that annex? During the time where Stéphane Bainzel was the CEO?
Yes, that's a good conspiracy. It does come to a dead end. I looked into it, but it's a good one. It's a fun one. The French did build it. It is what they do. They build biolabs. There's big money in it. Mm-hmm. I think Technip was the company. They're also in oil and gas that do the certification of it. So they did not even certify that BSL-4 in Wuhan, but it is a French design with a bunch of Chinese help, and then with a bunch of U.S. input. So there's a great line that I came across from one of the Frenchmen, and it was, I can't even paraphrase it right now because I'm drawing a blank on it, but more or less the French were kicked out and the U.S. were brought in. So I need to, a lot of people, get lost in that BSL-4. They think like I did at one time, the French connection, a PLA connection, a CCP connection, some sort of, bioweapon connection. There's none of that. It was built by China in what is essentially a Western city, a Western academic city, for international collaboration. So They have invited Western virologists to go into that lab. And that's what we have. We have a Western virologist. She's one of the very few inside that lab at the time in late 2019.
Now, another question I have is Peter Daszak. Peter Daszak was invited by the WHO later on to do the sham investigation of the origins of the virus. He went over to Wuhan. But my understanding is that Daszak had already been over there. Did you find evidence of that?
The what had already been over there?
Peter Daszak had already been over to that lab many times. Is
Yeah,
that
he
true?
was there in October of 2019. I learned that in the research for the book. That is, coincidental. Ralph Barrick was there in October of 2018. There is a almost a full-time flight of virologists from Washington, D.C., from Chapel Hill, from UTMB Galveston, from, Hamilton, Montana, to Wuhan, China. So they
So
are there on a at least a bi-monthly basis. I mean, it is a lot. So
okay, so this goes back. How many years do you think U.S. scientists were taking flights to Wuhan to that lab?
2015 is when it really, got going. So in 2015, Tony Fauci's aerosol specialist, Vincent Munster, visited Wuhan. He is mainly, so that's in the back half of the book. Ralph Barrick was there in October of 2018. Peter Daszak's there at least once a year, maybe twice a year. So yeah, 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19 is essentially our patient zero moves into Wuhan around 2016, 17. So yeah, for the, about 4 years leading up to the pandemic, there was a
Now,
ton of Western virologists
now
in that town.
was Fauci ever over in that Wuhan lab?
No, he's been in China, but that was about a decade ago. But he has a great line in the book that he said, "You got to go where the action is." And what is in Wuhan is the question. Why Wuhan? Out of all the places on the planet, why did this
Right,
virus emerge from Wuhan? And
right.
that is essentially answered by one, answer. It is the live bat capital of the world. I didn't mention the animal that our patient zero was experimenting with. She was experimenting with live bats. These
Oh,
are these are mammals. So a lot of people get icked out by this, but these are not birds; they're mammals. They have fur, they have neocortex, they have furin inside their bat cells. They have ACE2 receptors similar to ours. They have an upper respiratory tract similar to ours. They have an upper respiratory tract temperature similar to ours. So anything that infects them can infect us. So Western virologists were utterly obsessed with bats, and what they were doing is putting them in labs. They is like everyone: Atlanta CDC BSL-4, Hamilton, Montana, UTMB down there in Galveston, Texas, not too far from me, a little further
mhm.
from you. They
Yeah.
are all putting live bats in these labs and they're jabbing them with the virus that they think comes from them. And they want to see the virus live inside these bats without symptoms. And this is cutting edge research because they're now using these bats as guinea pigs. These are the new lab monkeys. So there's a lot of correlation. I guess your viewers will love this part. There's a lot of correlation between the 070 mRNA vaccine patent and the SARS-CoV-2 DARPA diffuse proposal. They are essentially mirror images of each other. So I'm gonna get into the icky part right here. Essentially, I'm gonna tell you that the virus was the vaccine. I think we were all scared of having to take the vaccine, and we didn't want to take this experimental vaccine. Well, we took it already. What you thought was an infection was an inoculation. The spike protein of the mRNA vaccine is a mirror image of the spike protein of the
Yeah.
COVID-19. The
Yeah.
one big difference is this one comes from a needle and it goes into your body. This one's spread by aerosol. So
Yeah.
when you're developing an animal vaccine, you can't go around there and jab each animal individually. It's impossible. There's so many out there in the wild, you can't track them down. It's completely pointless. So from 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, the newest thing in Western virology was called a self-spreading vaccine. So
Right.
you inject one animal and it spreads to the next animal, it spreads to the next animal, it spreads to the next animal. And that's essentially what COVID-19 is. It is a contagious bat vaccine. And it was aerosolized in Tony Fauci's personal biodefense lab in Hamilton, Montana. And I have basically identified that as our ground zero for the development of this thing because I knew the test results of a experiment run in the Atlanta, Georgia BSL-4. And I confronted the guy in the lab from here in Houston, sitting behind this desk like I am right now. You're seeing unpublished data. And he says, yeah, I am. And he gave me the data I needed. And I went into the FOIA documents to find what I needed, which was essentially our smoking gun email. So it's a long story that requires a long book to get it. But yes, it is Ralph Barrick's genome, but he had some help. This thing was aerosolized for a purpose. It made contagious for a purpose. It was designed and developed to float through air and infect you in less than
Hmm.
15 minutes on purpose. These are design features, not a bug. The asymptomatic spread, which I think you've talked about a ton, was actually a design feature, not a bug. That because they
Mm.
because the vaccine is designed to evade your immune system, and you carry on with your day as a lab animal. You basically run about, fly off, fly back without any symptoms, and you can basically create a vaccine that has absolutely no symptoms, and it's a perfect vaccine. Even for animal vaccines, they do not want it to have symptoms. So the asymptomatic spread of COVID-19 was another clue
Oh,
that this
uh,
thing
okay.
was a
I'm starting to get it now. So let me just make sure I understand this. So the creation of the virus, that the virus itself, the design of it itself was to actually be a spreading vaccine, almost like kind of an attenuated virus that would would give us immunity to something. So by design, it had to spread almost asymptomatically, uh, because you're right. There's papers in the veterinary vaccine literature and others, about spreading vaccines, and of course, the animal of choice is the bat. Um, so let me try
Yes,
to
Chinese bats.
yeah. So
And
let me
that's the
try to piece together a few more pieces here. This is so fascinating. Um, the 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 nascent or the primordial SARS-CoV-2 virion, is its origin when it was born? Was it born on U.S. soil and then brought to Wuhan, or was it born in Wuhan?
It's called WA1. That is the most ancestral strain of SARS-CoV-2
Right,
on the planet. It
right.
means it means Washington Area 1, Seattle, Washington. I think you may be from the area,
Yeah.
but yeah, that is what is essentially the biological proof of a Wuhan area lab leak in a U.S. area lab origin. That is chapter 27 in the book. That's a bit into the weeds, but I'll give you the short,
Yeah.
dirty. So there was an Asian American in Seattle who went back to Wuhan in November of 2019. He never visited the wet market. He never went near anything regarding, a lab, not a lab, well, even a lab animal or a wet market animal. So, but he was visiting family and renewing his visa, and he traveled back to the U.S. 6 weeks later on January 15th, 2020. He is, essentially the courier for what I'm proposing has leaked from the Wuhan lab. So this is our patient zero traveling back to America on January 15th, 2020. Inside his lungs is the virgin virus that leaked from that Wuhan BSL-4. And inside his lungs, he goes back to Seattle from Wuhan, and the US CDC reaches into his lungs and isolates a sample called WA1, Washington Area 1. And that this is the best part of the story in my mind. They send it off to all the labs in the US, and they're now experimenting with the ancestral strain. This predates lineage A and B inside the Wuhan wet market. This predates all lineages.
Hmm.
It is the virgin virus, and this was the trick question I asked over 100 virologists in the back of the book. If
Hmm.
you could give me an answer for this, a biological reason for this, I'll let you have a zoonotic
Hmm.
origin. But if you can't, you have to agree that this thing leaked from the Wuhan lab, and this patient is the proof. So what the real quick, so the sample was sent around to U.S. labs, and every U.S. lab pulled out their lab books and pulled out their lab animals, and they started testing on it, and they started putting it inside their lab animals. And in the process of doing that, we learned which lab animals transmit COVID. And there's only 5 lab animals on the planet that transmit the WA1 ancestral strain, and all 5 of those lab animals are found in Fauci's personal biodefense lab in Montana. So that was essentially what I call the return to sender. The return to sender, basically. So if Montana were to send a serum to Wuhan for testing, then it leaks from the lab accidentally in Wuhan. Then there's an Asian American in Wuhan who travels back to the U.S. to Seattle on January 15th with that sample inside of his lungs. We can now see essentially what leaked and what leaked from that lab and what lab animals are used to develop it. And to make a long story short, it is the biological proof of a Wuhan area lab leak in a Rocky Mountain lab origin. So that's where the story really gets crazy for people to understand. The same guy, Tony Fauci, that told us to wear a mask, take the gene jab, to shut down the schools, to close down the office, to do all this. He didn't just take your tax dollars and toss it over the Pacific and some China messed up. This thing was developed in his own biodefense lab by his own aerosol specialist. I have asked the guy for an alibi, and he has yet to provide it. And his own colleagues, actually, in the process of testing this WA1 sample, have thrown him under the bus. And we run through this through the book, so I don't want to go too far off
Holy
the deep end
smokes!
here.
This is like a James Bond movie. This is Jim. This is unbelievable. So you're saying Anthony Fauci has his own personal kind of
Playground. That's what it
playground
is.
in
Yes, it's a
Montana?
playground, and they were experimenting with self-spreading vaccines since 2011. Do you remember Ebola? There was a nurse in Dallas that got sick, and he
Yeah,
took a bunch of photo ops with that.
yeah.
So that was like 2009 or 10 or something around that time.
No, it
About
was
10
no.
plus.
I think it was later. It was later than that because maybe it was like 2015 or so. Yeah.
Okay, well, around that time period, Rocky Mountain Labs started experimenting with a self-spreading Ebola vaccine. So the idea, I'm not going to blame anyone in the book. I think we're all kind of susceptible to this, but a lot of people get panicked over these foreign viruses that emerge in their backyard. And this nurse that got infected in Dallas caused everyone to just, oh my gosh, Ebola infected an
Mm.
American. Everyone just like stopped what they were doing, and it was like headline news for a year. And they just shoveled more billions of dollars at Fauci to do something about it. And that's when his biolab in Montana started experimenting with Ebola vaccines. And Ebola comes from bats. MERS comes from bats. SARS comes from bats. Rabies comes from bats. All these pathogens that basically they're finding out in the wild and occasionally spill over to humans in a natural process, unfortunately, come from bats. So the idea was to vaccinate the animal reservoir. It was, it sounds crazy, but I think we've experimented with these people for the past couple of years. They wanted to vaccinate every living organism on the planet, and the idea was to vaccinate the bats. And Fauci's lab, after that nurse fell ill in Dallas, his lab, there's basically a paper trail of them experimenting with what they even talk about not having to do blow darts into the monkey, basically, because that's a bit annoying, isn't it, to go out there into the bushes of Africa and have to blow dart each monkey? So they said, why don't we just come up with a contagious vaccine? And that's when the idea started. So this was ground zero. I actually call the Wuhan wet market, Hamilton, Montana. That's where this giant biodefense lab is. Every lab animal that we thought, was involved in COVID-19, humanized mice, monkeys, cats, none of them work. We were looking for onward transmission. It's what we were looking for. It infects me, it infects you, and it keeps infecting. And just onward transmission. That's what we were looking for. And all 5 of those models are found inside that Rocky Mountain lab. So that was our proof. So this thing, I think that's what really makes this story hard for people to digest. You telling me the guy that, you told us to wear a mask and take the vaccine was the guy that created this?
The guy who pretended on TV that he was surprised by every twist and turn of the virus. I mean, that's the thing. When Peter Daszak, EcoHealth Alliance, goes over to Wuhan, the WHO asked him to go over. Remember, Rear Admiral Brett Giroir nominated 3 independent scientists. And he went to medical school here in Dallas. I'm in Dallas, Southwestern, a few years ahead of me. And the WHO goes, no, Dr. Giroir, we don't want your scientist. We want Peter Daszak. So Peter Daszak goes over to Wuhan. He does an investigation. He says, I don't know where it came from, but it definitely did not come from the lab that he had been to so many times while they were doing all this research, that it must have come out of nature. So the WHO must be in on this too. Did you research?
Yeah, I hate to make it sound like a grand conspiracy. There's only about 5 people on the planet that knew the SARS-CoV-2 genome before January 2020. So it's not so much a cover up. Even if those 5 came forward and said we did it, I don't think anyone would believe them besides me. So it was so easy to keep quiet because there's so few involved. Even Peter Daszak's a bit in the dark at the beginning. Ralph Barrick knows the genome. Vincent Munster, Tony Fauci's aerosol specialist, knows the genome. Linfa Wang knows the genome, and his subordinate in the Wuhan BSL-4 knows the genome. That's about 4, and there's a couple others that do. So that's really it. But Peter Daszak, don't worry, he's involved. He took his DARPA Diffuse proposal, which was $14.2 million, and DARPA said no, too much, get lost. He chopped it up into 3 pieces, and then he slipped it underneath the radar into Fauci's budget. And I don't know if they worked together to do this because it was so ingenious the way he chopped it up, but I worked through it in the book because I traced Peter Daszak's movements from 2018 and 2019. This is the dark period. DARPA has told him, no, you're not going to insert furin cleavage sites and test them on live bats in Wuhan. And now he wants a $14 million, in his pocketbook, because that's, essentially what this biodefense industry is. This is multinational, giant boondoggle. And he's gone now to Tony Fauci. I think it was always a question of who funded this thing. And in the process of writing the book, I figured out how Daszak funded the thing. And like a great salesman trick, he chopped up the $14.2 million bid into 3 grants totaling 14.1. And if you look very closely, you can find the furin cleavage site in Tony Fauci's documents. I even found the SARS-CoV-2 genome in the 2019 documents. I mean, this was the mother of all cover-ups, and they almost got away with it as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, well, let me ask you a little bit more. So I've always been interested in the 2 papers by Vineet Menachery published in Nature Medicine and then Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And one of them calls it a SARS-like Wuhan Institute of Virology 1 virus. Now, they don't describe the furin cleavage joint, but they thank Peter Daszak. One paper, they don't have any Chinese authors. The other one, they do. Ralph Barrick is an anchor. Is what they are describing in those papers, is that primordial SARS-CoV-1, or is that a prototype, or what is it?
It's what's called a clone. A genetic clone of it. It is a synthesized version of SARS-CoV-1. It is a lab-created version of SARS-CoV-1. So Ralph Barrick is such a genius. Him and his number 1 postdoc, Vineet Menachery, can create a Chinese virus in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, without actually having the virus. They just need the genome sequence.
Yeah.
So the guy can download the genome sequence. That is the letters, basically the code, what is essentially DNA,
Right.
converted into RNA, and he resurrects this thing and he brings it to life with his own reverse genetic engineering system. And this is where he is head and shoulders above everyone, not just the Chinese, his own colleagues in like Vanderbilt, the University of Washington, Hamilton, Montana can't even do it. No one on the planet can do what Ralph Barrett can do. He can create something from nothing. He is
Right.
probably the only person on the planet that has ever created something, a complex life form from nothing.
Right. Now, Jim, as far as I know, there was a press release, and I think it's somewhere around 2021, actually, where someone asked Barrick about these papers. And they said, well, why don't you release the genetic code for these papers? There's a 2015 Nature Medicine paper. It was like late 2015 and then 2016. And in the press release, Barrick says, well, I've talked about it with the NIH, presumably Anthony Fauci, and we think it's in the nation's best interest that we don't release the code. So it's almost like it's a biosecurity move to not release the code. So do you think that code released would match the code that was printed in January 2020?
No, but it was a clue, and you were on the right track. So
Okay.
the theory is for lab leak that Ralph Barrett taught Xi Jinping or someone in China how to engineer something like SARS-CoV-2, but he never released the code, so he never showed anyone how to do it. So therefore, his method was obscure, to use his word. So he has made that abundantly clear, both before and after the DARPA Diffuse documents leaked. I did not teach anyone in China or anyone in America how to do what I can do. My $100 million biotech is in my head, and it stays there. No one can touch this. No one can do this. No one can recreate this because I never uploaded the genome sequence. Yes, he did give it up in like January, what was it, May of 2020. That was when he uploaded. That turned into its own conspiracy, myself included. It's like, what were you hiding and why were you hiding it? He was hiding his reverse genetic engineering methods from the Chinese and from his other, coronavirus labs in the U.S. and Western Europe. No, he has a very, unique way of doing it. It's called cDNA, and he essentially can turn. It allows him to turn nothing into something. It is essentially his own, proprietary, cookbook that no one else has ever replicated, since COVID-19 hit. So that was Barrick not hiding something from us. He's hiding something from the Chinese. So again, the running theory in lab leaks is that Barrick taught her how to do it. He didn't teach her anything. So she cannot do this. I go through the book in chapter 14 that basically proves, biologically speaking, she does not have the reverse genetic system to create a SARS-CoV-2 genome. It's biologically impossible. Only he does. And only he does, and only he knew how to do it by not uploading the code. So yeah, it was a conspiracy. I was in on it, thinking that's a bit of a weird move, Ralph. But he was like, how when you patent something, you may not want to give up the ingredients. That's what he was doing. He didn't want to give up the ingredients.
Now, so was the virus, the primordial virus, let's call it SARS-CoV-2, whatever the very first version of it, was it physically created in the United States? It was.
In Chapel Hill.
In Chapel Hill, and then it was transported
to Rocky Mountain Lab in Hamilton, Montana. So
Okay.
there is a FOIA out I highlighted in the book where we see it move, where he's working with the Montana lab, where he's running, where he's creating genomes in Chapel Hill, which has very little tiny bits and pieces of SARS-CoV-2 in there already. And he's then sending it. What they do is, these virologists are international. They call it the cold chain. And essentially it starts in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and then it moves into Hamilton, Montana. And that's where Fauci's operation is. So Ralph Barrick only has a BSL-2, BSL-3 with his humanized mice. They're worthless for aerosolizing an agent. And to Ralph Barrick's defense, he's not a mad scientist. His humanized mice were ironically a stopgap for a pandemic. They don't sneeze. They can't transmit pathogens through the air. Even if the mouse bit you with this furin cleavage site, it won't infect you. Even if you eat the mouse with SARS-2 in it and belch its remnants in the air, I can't infect you. But so what he did essentially was push the genomic edge inside that Chapel Hill lab with this very safe mouse model. And he was a mad scientist in a very safe way. And so I think he has his biggest regret in life would be giving up his genome to Hamilton, Montana. But once he sends it there, and we have the FOIAs to show it, and it's in the book. That's where things start to go sideways. This relatively benign genome of Ralph Barrick's, this novel pathogen, which he patented in 2018, by the way, is now being turned into this airborne pathogen, not for nefarious purposes, not for evil purposes, but to get the thing transmissible. It's now cheaper this way. Ralph Barrick's technology was expensive, but he's now hopped in bed with the competition who won the DARPA Diffuse project. They won the DARPA project. This Montana lab of Tony Fauci's was the main contractor on the DARPA program. It's a very weird industry, this
Wow.
DOD, yes, this DOD money going to a NIAID lab in Hamilton, Montana. The DARPA winners were based in Hamilton, Montana. So Dazik lost, and the guys in Montana won. So the losers have now hopped in bed with the winners, and they've now basically joined forces, and they've created this ultimate pathogen called SARS-CoV-2.
Wow.
It is aerosolized in the BSL-4 lab.
Now, Jim, we're just going to have to take a break for our commercial sponsors. This is unbelievable. I really hope this becomes a movie to try to track this as we, we're racing across the world trying to put all this together. Your research is stunning. We've been talking to engineer, author, scientist, and investigative journalist Jim Haslam. You're listening to the McCullough Report. Let's get real. Let's get loud on America Out Loud Talk Radio. This is McCullough Report. Pause right here. Let's get real. Let's get loud on America Out Loud Talk Radio. This is the McCullough Report and Courageous Discourse Substack. We're learning about a lab. It sounds like it was a secret, but maybe it's not. It's never been mentioned in the press. Was this Hamilton, Montana lab, Jim, ever mentioned in the real Anthony Fauci or any of the books written by Robert F. Kennedy or anybody else, Rand Paul?
Rand Paul has mentioned it. I believe he's read what I've been writing. So he has been on it, all over it. Jeff Sachs has been on it, all over it. These two, truth seekers are as suspicious as I am of this lab. I mean, anyone that's looked closely at the evidence, has wound up in Hamilton, Montana. It sounds so counterintuitive. It's such an abstract thought. There's something that emerged in Wuhan could be developed in
was
Hamilton.
The final virus assembled in Hamilton, Montana?
More or less, yes. That's where Vincent Munster, Tony Fauci's personal aerosol specialist, aerosolized the agent. He aerosolized Ralph Barrick's genome. He made it transmissible. He made it float through the air up to 60 feet. He made it infect you in less than 15 minutes.
And was it at that point in time a virus that could replicate?
Yes.
Okay.
In the upper respiratory tract of a mammal. That's what he's targeting. He calls it the 3 phenotypes. He wants a massive amount of virus in your upper respiratory tract at a targeted temperature. It just so happens that the animal he's targeting has a similar H2 receptor to us, a similar temperature gradient to us, a similar furin inside their
but it's being designed to be a transmissible vaccine.
Yes, a transmissible animal vaccine. So transmission was actually engineered into this. This is a feature, not a bug.
Right. And so was it engineered to be a bioweapon?
No, it's called dual use research of concern, because that's what Tony Fauci calls it. I love that term, DIRC, dual use research of concern. That's what I call it. That's what we should call it. It is very quickly, when you're dealing with a vaccine, you're also dealing with a virus. When you're dealing with something on a defensive posture, you're going to become offensive. Even a kitchen knife's dual use. But I mean,
but okay. So Jim, this is the first time you've helped me understand this. If you go on the National Security Administration website and so many other agencies, it'll say that SARS-CoV-2 with a low likelihood may have come out of the Wuhan lab, but it's not a bioweapon. They say that with great certainty. Is that because the agencies know that it was actually being designed to be a spreadable vaccine?
DARPA knew. That's for sure. And I think DARPA was the only one that knew. It's called the Pentagon's brain for a reason. It's like the best of the best, the brightest of the brightest. So that's where this Major Murphy, the whistleblower I identify, he was a public record, but I don't think anyone understood him. And this is really his story, not mine. He's the one that wrote a letter to the DOD saying SARS-CoV-2 is an American-created bat vaccine. And he went into great detail talking about the immune evasion of it and how it was a live attenuated vaccine. He brought attention to Barrick's 2018 paper, which I bring attention to. I couldn't really tell what this paper was that Ralph Barrick was working on, but it was an animal vaccine. So DARPA was the one that pieced it together. And Major Murphy was the one that walked off the DARPA campus, the heavily guarded DARPA campus, with the documents and the knowledge to tell us mortals like myself what it is. We were all kind of in the dark about what this thing is. And once he told us it was an animal vaccine, the only people that could have figured that out was DARPA, because DARPA was asking for people to produce it. So to make a long story short, they ratted themselves out.
Okay, so there are beta coronaviruses that can get humans sick, before all this. why would anybody want to create a transmissible coronavirus vaccine for a
to
bat?
yeah, it was all about there are 100,000 US troops in the Far East. There are 50,000 troops in the Middle East. There's like 20,000 troops in Africa. So when DARPA went out in 2017 and 2018 to the Peter Daszak's of EcoHealth of the world and said, "Look, we want you to design a vaccine for these bats that are emitting these nasty pathogens and hindering our operations, in the Far East, Middle East, and Africa." And Daszak's like, "Yeah, of course, I'll get on board with that right away." And they DARPA encouraged the
Oh,
EcoHealth of the world
okay.
to
So I
develop
get
this
it.
kind of technology.
So they're trying to improve the population immunity of bats.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what they were doing. That's exactly what they're doing. So now we are the bats.
Yeah. Yeah,
The Tony
essentially.
Fauci has turned 8 billion humans into his own lab bats. So what we thought, remember like the memory B and T cells and all these other
Yeah.
little weird, kind of immunological side effects of SARS-CoV-2 that made no sense, that we all thought was a bioweapon, or we all thought it was a virus. I sent you a list, what I populated chapter 12 with. I'll resend it to you. When I sent it to the virologist over there in Australia, and I said, "Look, I need your opinion on this list." In 2018, there's a document that lists every weird side effect of SARS-CoV-2, and it was
Mhm.
sitting in the DARPA server. In 2018, let me repeat that. In 2018, there's 12 weird phenotypes. It is a weird, what they call pathways or signals, and all 12 of them essentially show up in SARS-CoV-2. And this document in 2018 was part of the DARPA Diffuse proposal. And I put it in front of the Australian virologist, and he replied back, "Dr. Haslam, this is interesting." And he copied in the one guy I really didn't want the conversation. I was trying to go around him in the process of doing this. So I don't want to make it sound like, I figured all this out or I have all the answers to it. I have run it by, virologists, in all four corners of the world, to basically say, "Look, was this the cookbook for COVID?" And, more or less it was. What you thought intracellular, proteasis is the term that Ralph Barrick used when he inserted that furin cleavage site, but it allowed it to attack the organs inside of our human body. And since he attenuated the vaccine for a bat's tank-like immune system, the bats have an immune system that's just, fascinates Western virologists. You can inject Marburg into them and they blink at you. It doesn't affect them. You can inject SARS into the bat and it doesn't affect them. It'll make you sick. It may kill us if it was Marburg, but it doesn't bother the bat at all. So in the process of doing this, they were studying the bat's immune system because it's a guinea pig. It's an ability to develop new vaccines. So, like I tried to say earlier, these bats are the new lab rat. They are the monkey. They are abundant and they are immune, and they are a pathway to a human vaccine. So I don't make it sound like, this thing they set out to blow up the world, but us mammals have a lot of similarities in our ACE2 receptors, furin, and whatnot.
Well, I tell you, we've been having an absolutely fascinating conversation. We're going to have to bring in a close. Jim, can you show us the book again and tell us the title?
COVID-19 mystery solved. It leaked from a Wuhan lab, but it's not Chinese junk. And
Yeah.
on the very back, you see that on the cover is the picture of the BSL-4
Hmm.
that the French built for the Wuhan,
Yeah.
crew. And the back is a picture of Tony Fauci's lab in Montana.
Oh my
So
gosh.
I think the
Now,
book kind of bookends very well.
Jim, everyone's going to have to get the book. I'm going to provide a copy of it, the link in the show notes, and I'll probably make the cover art, the book. Let me ask you this. Is there anything in this book that, as an author, that you think is conjecture, that you wrote as kind of a leap that you don't think is going to be supportable, that someone can pick apart?
They'll probably pick apart the way it got out of the lab, or they'll probably pick apart, a patient zero. But in the process of writing the book, I came across the smoking gun email, and I put it in front of the dozen or so virologists that'll interact with me, and it hurts their brain to read it. So I'm trying to play devil's advocate basically against it, but more or less it's solved until a virologist pokes a hole in that smoking gun email. It is essentially it's a little inside baseball. I don't want to get into it, but it's been put in front of several virologists that they can come up with an answer for it. And if I were to come up with, I guess, the devil's theory to the whole thing, it was an unintended consequence of good intentions. So I don't want to create any villains in this story. I don't
Mhm.
think anyone's really to blame per se either. But the creation and cover up of COVID-19, was definitely.
You may be familiar with the two papers by Yan that are not peer reviewed. They're in the preprint server, and then one by Farkas. It's published in Military Medicine. where he's concluded, he goes through it like a, like a 2 or 3 dozen checkpoint for a biological weapon. And Farkas concludes that SARS-CoV-2 is a biological weapon. It meets the criteria. Is it just so happen that it meets the criteria, but it also, in a sense, by design, was basically a vaccine for bats?
Yeah, that's exact. If it was attenuated for a bat's tank-like immune system. So when it got out of the BSL-4 box in Wuhan, it was not going to downplay that. It's basically coming at you hard because it's been attenuated, weakened for bats, not for humans. But as it worked through the population, it de-attenuated itself and it became a little less lethal over time. It's still very lethal to elderly. Don't take me wrong from that. But it's a 99.9% survival rate. That's not a bioweapon. It's just not. It's just
I got it. So this is starting to really make sense. So it is a live attenuated spreadable vaccine for bats by design.
As crazy as that sounds, that's exactly what it is. I've gone into the research. I showed you that in 2018 they were using what's called an American deer mouse to train this thing to transmit in the Rocky Mountain lab. Guess what COVID transmits in? An American deer mouse. You will not find American deer mice in Wuhan, but you will find it in Fauci's biodefense lab in Montana. The other one is the American mink. The other one is called the American lab bat, called the Egyptian fruit bat. American deer. You remember the American deer? Remember COVID and deer, Peter? Wasn't that weird for all of us? Like, what the hell is that going on? American scientists use American deer to model self-spreading vaccines. That's what really piqued my interest in 2022 when COVID was in deer. I'm not talking COVID antibodies. I'm talking about virus living inside the deer without an immune response. That's called the reservoir host. It is the only wildlife reservoir host on the planet, and it's the American deer. There's European deer, there's Asian deer, but COVID's living in American deer. And once I learned that American deer were used by American scientists to model self-spreading vaccines, it's a giant snout. It's a jumping off point to get the pathogen airborne. This guy over there, Munster, was a bit crazy and a bit over the top, essentially, but you had to get the thing airborne. And the way you do this with these large lab
animals. Now, has this guy Munster, who's Fauci's kind of lab director at this Hamilton, Montana lab, has he ever been called to testify in Congress?
No, but he's becoming more and more well known. He is a secondary suspect behind Ralph Barrick. Ralph Barrick was called to testify. So give the COVID committee credit. They cornered him, and his story didn't add up. That's how we learned about him being called for that February 1st, 2020 teleconference. But Vincent Munster has flown under the radar. He was Mr. DARPA. He is the aerosol specialist. I don't know if you remember in 2012, there was a New York Times headline that called it an engineered doomsday. And they were talking about what was essentially the Erasmus University in the Netherlands doing experiments on ferrets. And it was Ron Fouchier and his number one protege, Vincent Munster. He was the lead author on those papers. So this guy, he's been, in the background, and I'm trying to bring him into the foreground. I don't really feel bad for the guy. He's not completely responsible for the thing, but I have directly asked him 3 times over for an alibi, and he won't provide it.
So Munster leads to Ron Fouchier, who's also
Munster leads to Fauci is the big story, but yes, he is Ron Fouchier's protege. You know who that is?
Yeah, well, he's in our paper about the gain of function work done on bird flu. So
yeah, so that's his number one protege. I believe I don't know how he did it. A lot of like Ralph Barrick, his secret was not published per se. Ron Fouchier was not allowed to publish how he did it. So that's a bit of a there's an idea that if you put an idea on paper that everyone knows how to do it. No, even Ron Fouchier has explained. This is a very tiny very specialized piece of knowledge to be able to learn how to make a pathogen transmissible.
Okay, so, listen. Jim, we've got to get your book. We're going to get your book. We're going to read it. We're going to scrutinize it. You're no petroleum engineer. You are an investigative author. I can tell you, your blood is flowing with this right now. I can tell you love the hunt of investigation. And this probably is the story of all time. Because
I'm glad you hear it. I'm glad you have me on to talk about it. Because
the whole world got sick with it, and we've been trying to piece it together to get some interpretive framework. And I'm a doctor. I've been trying to, field all these things that don't make sense. And I still, I saw patients today that I'm still finding it a mystery, both with the infection and the vaccine. So we've been talking to Jim Haslam, who is an investigative author. He's published a terrific book. We are going to really scrutinizes COVID-19 mystery solved. It involves, in a sense, an international collaboration, but so much more U.S. involvement than I think anybody ever thought. Jim, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thanks for having me, Peter.
Let's get real. Let's get loud. On America Out Loud Talk Radio, this is McCullough Report and Courageous Discourse Substack. I'm your host, Dr. Peter McCullough. Thanks for listening.